Chapter 3. We seem to hate ourselves. Radical simply means grasping things at the root. Angela Davis. Claudette left her house on the first day of high school, determined to put her mind on her studies. Delphine's funeral, just 2 weeks before, had been as sad and bewildering a day as she could remember, but now she hoped she could put it behind her. Now it was time to focus. Booker T. Washington High, whose sports teams were known as the Yellow Jackets, was one of Montgomery's two public high schools for black students, the other being George Washington Carver High. Almost all the sons and daughters of Montgomery's working class black families went to either Washington or Carver, with a few Catholic students attending St. Jude's and many of the children of Montgomery's black professionals enrolled at other private schools. Booker T. Washington High was a buff-colored, three-story brick citadel. The glass in the lower windows was painted white so students couldn't look out at the street. Desktops were gorged and book covers cracked. Pages were torn from years of use. There was so little money from city funds that each year the principal put on a fundraising event to buy desks, books, and equipment for the cafeteria. In the fall of 1952, the air around the building was thick with the dust of construction as workers raced to complete a new wing to the school before winter in an effort to keep up with Montgomery's expanding black population. Though being smart was an asset, Claudette soon found that having light skin and straight hair was the surest key to popularity at Booker T. Washington. Many girls woke up and spent hours applying hot combs to their hair, trying to straighten it to look, as some said, almost white. But Claudette's hair wouldn't stay straight or flat no matter how long she pressed it, and her skin was very dark. On top of that, she was from King Hill, a neighborhood she loved but others scorned, and no matter how hard she fought it, Delphine's death had left her feeling raw and lonely, especially when she passed the spot each day where her sister had always waited for her after school. Suddenly alone, Claudette started life as a yellow jacket, feeling she was at the very bottom of the social heap. Claudette. Right after Delphine died, I became very sensitive. Just about any cruel word or insult could start me crying, even if it was aimed at someone besides me. One thing especially bothered me. We black students constantly put ourselves down. If you were dark complexioned, they'd call you nappy headed. Not nappy haired, nappy headed. And the N word. We were saying it to each other, to ourselves. I'd hear that word and I would start crying. I wouldn't let people use it around me. How could you hear such things and not feel emotional? When girls said things like that, it was bad enough, but when boys said them to you, it really hurt. For some reason, we seem to hate ourselves. We students put down our hair texture and skin color all the time. Can you imagine getting up in the morning every day and looking in the mirror and saying to yourself, I have bad hair, or I'm black and nobody likes me? The football players went for the girls with flowing hair and lighter skin and who could grow wavy shoulder-length hair. It'd be a biracial kid. The girls with the darkest complexions never got picked to be queen of anything. Middle-class black girls would always try to separate themselves from the dark-skinned girls like me and emulate white girls. Tragedy struck again in November when Claudette's schoolmate and neighbor, 16-year-old Jeremiah Reeves, was arrested and charged with raping a white housewife. Reeves confessed to the crime. Police quickly expanded the charges, claiming he was responsible for raping 6 white women after breaking into their homes. Blacks in Montgomery were furious. Most were convinced that the police had forced him to confess. One of the authorities had led him to the death chamber, threatening that if he did not confess at once, he would burn there later, Martin Luther King Jr., then the new pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, wrote. After a brief trial, an all-white jury sentenced Reeves to death in the electric chair. This brought blacks throughout Alabama to a boiling point. Even if Reeves was guilty of the charges, something few blacks believed, he hadn't killed anyone. Why should he pay with his life? Blacks knew that no white man accused of a similar crime against a black woman would have been convicted at all, let alone sentenced to die. The verdict radicalized many students at Booker T. Washington High. Reeves was a popular senior, widely admired as a talented drummer. He hadn't fled from the police. In fact, he had turned himself in. A note. The NAACP. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was formed in 1909 in New York City by a group of black and white citizens fighting for social justice. Ever since, the NAACP has organized demonstrations, pickets, and legal actions to expand and defend the rights of people of color. Many cities and communities have local NAACP chapters, including the Montgomery chapter, which provided support to Jeremiah Reeves. Everyone had always predicted Jeremiah Reeves would go somewhere special. Now he wasn't going anywhere at all, unless something could be done. He would languish on death row until he turned 21 and became legally old enough to take the short walk from his cell to the electric chair. Jeremiah's plight pulled Claudette's attention away from her personal difficulties to the injustices blacks faced everywhere. She went to rallies, wrote letters to him in prison, and collected money for his legal defense. The effort to support Jeremiah Reeves became the first time many black teenagers in Montgomery ever acted to address injustices outside their own personal problems. Claudette Colvin was one of those teens. Claudette. Jeremiah Reeves' arrest was the turning point of my life. That was when I and a lot of the other students really started thinking about prejudice and racism. I was furious when I found out what had happened. Jeremiah lived right below us on the hill. I knew him well and admired him like everybody else did. We girls thought he was like a rock star because he was so stylish. He always wore a starched, clean shirt, and there was never a spot of mud on his shoes. He was a wonderful drummer in the school band and in bands around town. The NAACP was called in to take his case. That was the first time I had ever heard of them. I think that's why the jury sentenced him to death, to show that NAACP couldn't take over the South. Everyone talked about Jeremiah Reeves at school. There were rumors that the jailers pulled out his fingernails and tortured him. One girl hid in a delivery truck and got into the jail but didn't make it to his cell. We showed movies to try and raise money for his lawyers. I would take whatever we raised to his mother. The hypocrisy of it made me so angry. Black girls were extremely vulnerable. My mother and my grandmother told me to never go anywhere with the white man, no matter what. I grew up hearing horror story after horror story about black girls who were raped by white men and how they never got justice either. When a white man raped a black girl, something that happened all the time, it was just his word against hers, and no one would ever believe her. The white man always got off. But now they were going to hold Jeremiah for years as a minor just so they could legally execute him when he came of age. That changed me. That put a lot of anger in me. I stayed angry about Jeremiah Reeves for a long time. A note. One girl's memory of Jeremiah Reeves. One friend and classmate of Claudette's was especially active in Jeremiah Reeves' defense. After an exchange of letters, Reeves invited the girl to visit him on death row along with his parents. Later, she remembered what it was like. To reach death row, you had to be escorted by a guard through several halls one by one. You'd step in one room, and the guard would slam the door loud behind you and turn the key. Then you'd go to the next room. Finally, you walked out into the backyard and up a flight of stairs. At that point, you passed right by the electric chair. I saw it. I'll never forget the sight of it. Jeremiah was 18 or 19 when I saw him in prison. He was a fine-looking young man in good health. He hadn't been tortured. He and 3 other prisoners had formed a quartet on death row. They couldn't see each other through the walls, but they could hear. Someone would sing a note and they would start in. His voice was rich and beautiful. They sang spirituals. Jeremiah was a very spiritual person, very caring. Again and again, he told me he believed he would get out someday. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court threw out Reeves's conviction and ordered a new trial. By then, Reeves had retracted his confession, insisting he had been forced by police to make it. For the rest of his life, he maintained he was innocent. But after 2 days' testimony, the new jury, again entirely white, took only 34 minutes to restore Reeves's death sentence. Now all hope was gone. Many at school wept for their classmate, but Claudette fumed. Why did everyone accept injustice? How could adults complain at home about the insulting way they were treated at work and then put on a happy face for their white employers? Why did her classmates worry about good hair when they had no rights? When was anybody ever going to stand up? Claudette was still furious about Jeremiah Reeves's plight when on the first day of her sophomore year, she met someone who gave her the confidence to transform her anger into action. Claudette. Miss Geraldine Nesbit dressed sharp, more like a sales lady than a school's teacher. She was slender and petite. She grew up in Montgomery and went to Alabama State College, but she had her master's degree in education from Columbia University in New York City. She came to school early and stayed late. She was tough, but she was out to make you learn. We were supposed to be an English literature class, but Miss Nesbit used literature to teach life. She said she didn't have time to teach us like a regular English teacher. We were too far behind. Instead, she taught us the world through literature. She taught the Constitution, she taught the Magna Carta and the Articles of Confederation. We studied Hawthorne and Poe. We discussed Patrick Henry's speech, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, and applied it to our own situation. We pick out a passage from the Bible and examine it from a literary standpoint. We wrote poems and essays and themes. We even wrote obituaries. She brought in her own books from home because we had so few books in our library at school. One day we all came into class. Miss Nesbit had her face buried in an open book. We all said, "Why are you doing that?" Finally, she came up with a big smile and said, "Ah, there's no smell as good as the smell of a new book." Right at the end of sophomore year, the Supreme Court ruled that public schools like ours would have to be integrated, though they didn't say when. Whenever it happened, it was bound to be a big change. Segregation was so total. It wasn't just that we went to separate schools. We even walked to school on opposite sides of the highway from whites, shouting insults at each other from across the street. In class, we asked each other, "Would you want to sit next to a white person?" A lot of students said things like, "If they don't want to sit next to me on a bus, why would I want one to sit next to me in class?" I felt differently. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to grow up and greet the world, and so did my best friends. I thought if whites came into our schools, maybe our textbooks would improve. Sometimes when I babysat, I'd sneak looks at the textbooks of white students who lived in those families. There were essays on the Lincoln Douglas debate, which I had never heard of. They made me think for the first time about the economic basis for slavery. While we were taking routine math, whites my age were studying algebra. Our school's entire set of encyclopedias had only two articles about blacks, Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. In fact, we had very few books of any kind in our school library, and the library downtown, the colored library, didn't have any more. Didn't have many more. I didn't care who I sat next to. I wanted a good education. Miss Nesbit made us see that we had a history too, that our story didn't begin by being captured and chained and thrown onto a boat. There had been a life and culture before that. She related literature back to our lives. She would ask, "Why do we celebrate the 4th of July, Independence Day, when we are still in slavery? Why are there no black people except Sammy Davis Jr. and Pearl Bailey on TV?" I had Miss Nesbit in both 10th and 11th grades, and during those years I grew in confidence. In those 2 years, she had challenged many assumptions I had taken for granted. She said, "There's no such thing as good hair. Hair is just hair. Everyone is born with the hair they have, and you just do the best you can with it." Same with skin color. She wanted us to love whatever color we were. Our history teacher, Miss Josie Lawrence, was the blackest teacher in the whole school, but she had the same attitude. She'd say, "I'm a real African. I'm pure-blooded African." She was proud of it. She taught us all the different nations of Africa and the periods of African history. It all made sense to me. I wasn't ashamed of my thick lips and broad nose and coarse hair. I had always thought God made our features so we could be comfortable in the hot African sun. Little by little, I began to form a mission for myself. I was going to be like Harriet Tubman and go north to liberate my people. I admired Harriet Tubman more than anyone else I read about. Her courage, the pistol she wore, the fact that she never lost a passenger on the Underground Railroad. I wasn't going to go to Alabama State College, where they taught you how to teach school but didn't teach you how to get your freedom. We had nothing but preachers and teachers in the South. I was going to do something different. I was going to be a lawyer. My mom always said I could out-talk any 40 lawyers. I agreed it would be a good fit. In 1955, my junior year, Miss Nesbit and Miss Lawrence team taught Negro History Week. We really got into it. We spent that whole February talking about the injustices we black people suffered every day in Montgomery. It was total immersion. My parents had only gone to the 6th grade. They'd never had a chance for a class discussion like that, so I was grateful for it and totally receptive. I was done talking about good hair and good skin, but not addressing our grievances. I was tired of adults complaining about how badly they were treated and not doing anything about it. I'd had enough of just feeling angry about Jeremiah Reeves. I was tired of hoping for justice. When my moment came, I was ready. A note. Brown vs. Board of Education of Topeka. Linda Brown was a third grade student who lived in Topeka, Kansas. She had to walk 5 long blocks to her school every day, even though she lived much closer to a school for whites only. Linda's father sued the city's government to let her go to the all-white school. The case was combined with several similar cases around the country, and it was argued all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court under the title Brown vs. Board of Education of Topeka. Lawyers from the NAACP represented Linda and the other black students. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that segregated schools did not give black students an equal chance for a good education. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote on behalf of the 9 justices, "We conclude unanimously that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." Some school systems integrated smoothly, but other communities took as long as 20 years to open the school doors to all students. Chapter 4. It's my constitutional right. Early in life, I had learned that if you want something, you had better make some noise. Malcolm X. March 2nd, 1955. Claudette and her classmates got out of school early that Wednesday because of a faculty meeting. When she stepped outside, the afternoon air was warm and muggy, already like summer. Claudette spotted some friends and ran to catch up with them. The group walked together for a few blocks, then got on the Highland Gardens bus at Dexter Avenue and Bainbridge Street. She handed the driver her pink coupon, which allowed a student to ride for 5 cents, half fare. Since there were no whites in the front of the bus, she and her classmates walked straight down the aisle without getting off. Claudette slid into a window seat on the left side near the exit door, about halfway back. A schoolmate plopped down beside her, and 2 other Booker T. Washington students took the seats across the aisle in the same row. Balancing her textbooks on her lap, Claudette settled back and gazed absently out the window as the bus pulled away from the curb. As the bus moved east along Dexter Avenue, the seats filled up block by block with white passengers getting off work from the downtown stores and offices. The 10 front seats went quickly, and soon riders were standing in the aisle, keeping their balance by clutching poles as the bus stopped and started. Just before they reached Court Square, Claudette realized that a white woman was standing in the aisle between the 4 seats in her row. Clearly, the woman expected Claudette and her 3 schoolmates to vacate the entire row so she could sit down in one of the seats. Claudette. The motorman looked up in his mirror and said, "I need those seats." I might have considered getting up if the woman had been elderly, but she wasn't. She looked about 40. The other 3 girls in my row got up and moved back. But I didn't. I just couldn't. Rebellion was on my mind that day. All during February, we'd been talking about people who had taken stands. We had been studying the Constitution in Miss Nesbitt's class. I knew I had rights. I had paid my fare the same as the white passengers. I knew the rule, that you didn't have to get up for a white person if there were no empty seats left on the bus. And there weren't. But it wasn't about that. I was thinking, why should I have to get up just because a driver tells me to, or just because I'm black? Right then, I decided I wasn't going to take it anymore. I hadn't planned it out, but my decision was built on a lifetime of nasty experiences. After the other students got up, there were 3 empty seats in my row, but that white woman still wouldn't sit down, not even across the aisle from me. That was the whole point of the segregation rules. It was all symbolic. Blacks had to be behind whites. If she sat down in the same row as me, it meant I was as good as her. So she had to keep standing until I moved back. The motorman yelled again louder, "Why are you still sitting there?" I didn't get up, and I didn't answer him. It got real quiet on a bus. A white rider yelled from the front, "You gotta get up." A girl named Margaret Johnson answered from the back, "She ain't got to do nothing but stay black and die." The white woman kept standing over my seat. The driver shouted, "Give me that seat!" "Then get up, gal." I stayed in my seat, and I didn't say a word. Exasperated by Claudette's non-response, the driver pushed on to the Court Square, Montgomery's major downtown transfer station for city buses. In the late afternoon rush hour, scores of weary passengers were lined up behind signs reading "Colored and White." At Court Square, the driver snapped open the doors and hollered for a transit policeman to come inside and make an arrest. Seconds later, a uniformed officer clambered aboard and the driver pointed down the aisle at Claudette. "It's her," he said. During these moments, as the bus idled, several passengers boarded through the rear door. One, a pregnant woman whom Claudette recognized as her neighbor, Mrs. Hamilton, sat down heavily in the empty seat next to Claudette. Of course, Mrs. Hamilton was totally unaware of the standoff between Claudette and the driver. All she knew was that for some reason a policeman was coming her way. A note. Court Square. If the historical importance of places could be detected by an instrument like a Geiger counter, Court Square would send the needle dancing. At Court Square, 6 downtown Montgomery streets converge around a fountain topped by a statue of Hebe, goddess of youth and a cupbearer to the gods. In the early 1800s, Court Square was the site of a major auction block where livestock, furniture, and slaves of all ages were exhibited and sold. Looking down Dexter Avenue from the fountain, one has a straight sight line to the Alabama state capitol, where in 1861, Jefferson Davis was sworn as the first president of the Confederate States of America. To the viewer's right is the Winter Building, where on April 10, 1861, a local boy delivered a telegram from Jefferson Davis instructing Confederate troops to start shelling Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The message touched off the Civil War. Court Square is also within sight of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, pastored by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from 1954 to 1960. In Court Square, as the major transfer point for city bus lines, figured centrally in the Montgomery bus protests. When he arrived, the officer saw that now there were 2 blacks seated in the disputed row. He ordered both women to rise. Mrs. Hamilton replied that she didn't feel like getting up. Claudette also refused. All eyes turned to the policeman. As much as he might have wanted to evict Claudette, he hesitated to bully a pregnant woman. Cocking a thumb toward Mrs. Hamilton, he addressed a group of black men seated in the rear. "If any of you are not gentlemen enough to give this lady a seat, you should be put in jail yourselves." 2 men rose and scrambled off the trouble-filled bus. Mrs. Hamilton slowly walked back and took one of their seats. Now Claudette was again alone in her row. The officer ordered her to get up. Again, Claudette refused. He returned to the driver and explained that as a transit policeman, he lacked the authority to make an arrest. The doors closed behind him as he stepped down onto the street, and the bus pulled away again. 1 block north, at the intersection of Bibb and Commerce Streets, a squad car was waiting. This time, when the Highland Gardens bus door opened, 2 Montgomery city policemen climbed aboard. Passengers held their breath. "Claudette," one of them said to the driver in a very angry tone, "who is it?" The motorman pointed at me. I heard him say, "That's nothing new. I've had trouble with that thing before." He called me a thing. They came to me and stood over me, and one said, "Aren't you going to get up?" I said, "No, sir." He shouted, "Get up!" again. I started crying, but I felt even more defiant. I kept saying over and over in my high-pitched voice, "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady. I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." I knew I was talking back to a white policeman, but I had had enough. One cop grabbed one of my hands, and his partner grabbed the other, and they pulled me straight up out of my seat. My books went flying everywhere. I went limp as a baby. I was too smart to fight back. They started dragging me backwards off the bus. One of them kicked me. I might have scratched one of them because I had long nails, but I sure didn't fight back. I kept screaming over and over, "It's my constitutional right." I wasn't shouting anything profane. I never swore, not then, not ever. I was shouting out my rights. It just killed me to leave the bus. I hated to give that white woman my seat when so many black people were standing. I was crying hard. The cops put me in the back of the police car and shut the door. They stood outside and talked to each other for a minute. Then one came back and told me to stick my hands out the open window. He handcuffed me and then pulled the door open and jumped in the back seat with me. I put my knees together and crossed my hands over my lap and started praying. All ride long, they swore at me and ridiculed me. They took turns trying to guess my bra size. They called me racial slurs and cracked jokes about parts of my body. I recited the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm over and over in my head, trying to push back the fear. I assumed they were taking me to juvenile court because I was only 15. I was thinking, Now I'm going to be picking cotton, since that's how they punish juveniles. They put you in a school out in the country where they made you do field work during the day. But we were going in the wrong direction. They kept telling me I was going to Atmore, the women's penitentiary. Instead, we pulled up to the police station and they led me inside. More cops looked up when we came in and started calling me thing and whore. They booked me and took my fingerprints. Then they put me in the back of the car and drove me to the city jail, the adult jail. Someone led me straight to a cell without giving me any chance to make a phone call. He opened the door and told me to get inside. He shut it hard behind me and turned the key. The lock fell into place with a heavy sound. It was the worst sound I ever heard. It sounded final. It said I was trapped. When he went away, I looked around me. 3 bare walls, a toilet, and a cot. I fell down on my knees in the middle of the cell and started crying again. I didn't know if anyone knew where I was or what happened to me. I had no idea how long I would be there. I cried and I put my hands together and prayed like I had never prayed before. Meanwhile, schoolmates who had been on the bus and had run home and telephoned Claudette's mother at the house where she worked as a maid. Girls went over and took care of the lady's 3 small children so that Claudette's mother could leave. Mary Ann Colvin called Claudette's pastor, the Reverend H. H. Johnson. He had a car, and together they sped to the police station. Claudette. When they when they led Mom back, there I was in a cell. I was crying hard, and then Mom got upset too. When she saw me, she didn't bawl out. She just asked, "Are you all right, Claudette?" Reverend Johnson bailed me out and we drove home. By the time we got to King Hill, word had spread everywhere. All our neighbors came around and they were just squeezing me to death. I felt happy and proud. I'd been talking about getting our rights ever since Jeremiah Reeves was arrested, and now they knew I was serious. Velma, QP, and Marianne's daughter, who was living with us at the time, kept saying it was my little squeaky voice that had saved me from getting beat up or raped by the cops. But I was afraid that night too. I'd stood up to a white bus driver and 2 white cops. I had challenged the bus law. There had been lynchings and cross burnings for that kind of thing. Wetumpka Highway that led out of Montgomery ran right past our house. It would have been easy for the Klan to come up the hill in the night. Dad sat up all night long with his shotgun. We all stayed up. The neighbors facing the highway kept watch. Probably nobody on King Hill slept that night. But worried or not, I felt proud. I had stood up for our rights. I had done something a lot of adults hadn't done. On the ride home from jail, coming over the viaduct, Reverend Johnson said something to me I'll never forget. He was an adult who everyone respected, and his opinion meant a lot to me. "Claudette," he said, "I'm so proud of you. Everyone prays for freedom. We've all been praying and praying. But you're different. You want your answer the next morning. And I think you just brought the revolution to Montgomery."